Glad to have everybody here tonight. I appreciate you coming back tonight. And it's good to see Mr. Gunner and Miss Andy Hill. Are you still writing your old last name, or are you got the new one down yet? You still got it? I remember when Laura and I first got married, she would write her old last name. I'm like, your name is Williams now. She finally got it. After 33 years, she got it down. We're glad to have everybody here tonight. We appreciate you all being here. You remember this morning, this graphic that I brought up and this verse that goes along with it. What we have been called to is to follow in the way of Jesus, to follow in his steps. And I made the comment this morning. I made this several times. But I want to get a little discussion going here, because this is crucial for everybody to understand. What our world commonly teaches, what you hear in most churches, not all, but you hear that what people are being called to do is to make a decision for Jesus. And I said this morning, and I will stand by it, we have not been called to make a decision for Jesus. We have been called to this. We've been called to follow in his steps. Now I want to stop right there for a minute and see, does everybody see the difference between the two? Or what would you say is the difference between making a decision and following in Jesus' steps, following in his way? What's the difference? Okay, what Casey said, to make a decision is to intellectually believe, and this follow requires action. Okay, that certainly is a difference. What else would be involved in this? Pardon me?
Following in his steps, you'd be much more mature in your faith. It's something that you wouldn't do when you just first started to believe, first was converted.
Do y'all remember this story? I've told this story several times. This is a true story about, and it was in the Church of Christ that occurred. There were these two junior high boys. They went forward at the invitation one Sunday morning, and they were both baptized. They put them on the church roll, made them members. The church gathered around and welcomed them, gave them a Bible like we do. The next day in the locker room at junior high, some of their friends said, we heard you guys went forward and got baptized yesterday. Does that mean you're going to quit cussing and doing this and doing that and drinking and going to these parties and, those kind of things? And they said, blank no, that was just insurance. Do y'all remember me telling that story? I think that illustrates very well the difference between what it means to follow in his steps and making a decision for Christ. Those two guys made a decision for Jesus. But that's not what we've been called to. Their thinking was, as long as I go forward and we get baptized and I can check that off, then I'm good to go and I can live the rest of my life however I want to. That is not what the New Testament teaches, and that's plainly not what this verse says. When you read all through the Gospels, Jesus called us not to make a decision. He never said that one time. He called us to be disciples, and that's a lifelong way of following in the steps of Jesus. Yes, Kim?
Isn't that like the parable of the rich young man?
The rich young ruler?
Yeah.
In what way?
Well, he comes to Jesus and says, what do I need to do to be saved? And he gives him several things. He says, Lord, I've done all these things. What else is there? And that was when Jesus said, sell everything you have and follow me.
Yeah, it's the way that you live your whole life. And I think this is so important for us to understand. It's a way of living, and it's all about following Jesus. And we talked this morning, and I want to just briefly go here, and then we're going to go into some new things. But I brought this verse up. The Pharisees and their religious teachers of religious law complained bitterly to Jesus' disciples, why do you eat and drink with such scum? That's what the New Living Translation says. In their view, in the religious leaders' view of things, what it means to be a follower of God means that we are to completely separate ourselves, which is what the word Pharisee means, a separated one. We're to separate ourselves from people who they would at least deem in their estimation to be below them because they were notorious sinners, unlike them, at least in their way of thinking. And they couldn't believe that Jesus, if he was this great religious teacher and great prophet like he claimed to be and so forth, that he could be associating with such scum. And Jesus replied to that, which was his way. This next verse is Jesus' whole philosophy of ministry, and it was this right here. Healthy people don't need a doctor, Jesus said. Sick people do. I have come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners and need to repent. Jesus said, my mission is to come and call people who need to repent, people who recognize their sinfulness. And that means associating with some people who have a lot of baggage a lot of times. The problem with the Pharisees and the religious leaders then was they did not think that they had sin. And we were talking about this morning, you know, why is it that when you read through the Gospels, very plainly, I think, real plainly, when you read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the pattern that you see recurring there all the time is the people who were down and out and people regarded as the scum of the earth, prostitutes, tax collectors, cheaters, adulterers, all these different kinds of people that we would all describe as being horrible people, it's obvious that they felt comfortable around Jesus. And Jesus created an environment about him where they felt welcome to come in his sphere, and he would show them love and mercy. And so the question I asked this morning, and I want to discuss tonight after we talked about this verse, is this. This verse is from the story, you might remember, that we falsely call the prodigal son. I think that's a bad name for that parable. It's not about one son, it's about two, and it's about a loving father. It should be the parable of the loving father and his two lost sons. And it says the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. The Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them, in a very condescending kind of way. And that's what prompted Jesus to tell the three parables he told in Luke's Gospel, chapter 15, including the parable of the loving father and his two lost sons. So the question that I asked this morning that I want to talk about tonight is this. So what has happened to reverse the pattern of Jesus so that sinners don't like being around us? Because when you read the Gospels, plainly, sinners were attracted to Jesus. They felt comfortable in his presence. I mentioned that story this morning in Luke chapter 7. The sinful woman comes into a Pharisee's home because she knows Jesus is there. She completely unburdens herself, lets her hair down in public, washes Jesus' feet with her tears. She felt completely welcome doing that, and she was a woman who had a very bad reputation. So what has happened to reverse that pattern so that in most churches today, I'm not going to say all, but most, people who are like that, down and out, people that we would consider questionable, why do they not feel comfortable around us?
Because we as Christians feel so clean that we don't want to be close to dirt. So therefore we do the one thing Christ didn't do. We won't allow them to get close to us because they're dirty. We don't want to be dirty.
Okay, so maybe as Roy said, maybe it's because we feel so dirty, or we feel so clean, we don't want to have dirty people, meaning, spiritually we're talking about, around us. Okay, could be that. Anybody else have an idea? Guilt makes who do what? Right? This question. Mm-hmm. So, is that the reason? Okay. So the question is, okay, maybe it was because they feel guilty. So why did they feel comfortable coming to Jesus when Jesus was perfectly pure, but they don't feel comfortable coming to us? Wouldn't they feel guilty going to Jesus?
He didn't condemn them for it.
Right. He didn't condemn them for it. Right. And what's your point you're trying to make with that?
We got to realize, or I have to realize, that my sin separates me from God. And I got to try to do something about it. So, he didn't when you say condemn him, he didn't look straight out and say, you're going to go to hell for that. He offered him a way to overcome their sin.
Okay, I feel like we're getting off track a little bit. Sin separates us from God, no doubt. That's not the point that I'm making tonight. No doubt sin separates us from God. But still, Jesus taught that plainly. That's why he came, was to make sure that we could be with God despite our sin. That's the whole reason Jesus came. But my point is that still sinners who were separated from God, who had lived horrible kinds of lives, it's plain when you read the Gospels. Is it not to you, or am I not reading the Gospels right? Is it plain to you that these people who were adulterers and tax collectors and horrible things, they would easily come and felt good in Jesus' presence? And yet plainly, I think it's obvious in our culture today, when people have horrible problems and they need to recognize they need to be dealt with, the first place they don't come is the church. So why was that the case with Jesus and it's not the case now? That's the question we're trying to get to.
Have a preacher on every corner, it used to be, condemning you for your way of life when they don't even know you. But you're not in their building. So therefore you can't be right. Just like Job was condemned by all of his good friends because you had to have done something, Job. When in fact he didn't. When you start looking down your nose at the people, they see what's coming out of your nose.
Okay. Looking down, you said. That's a key phrase.
I think there's something to this, though. They didn't come to Jesus when Jesus was the Son of God. Jesus went to them. So the availability that Jesus provides is a whole lot different than what the Jews did.
Okay, but in the story, you're right, and Jesus did go out to them, except on the occasion that I read this morning, Luke chapter 7, verse 36 to 50. That woman came into Jesus. Jesus did not go out and invite her to come into the Pharisee's house. But my point is still, they felt welcome around Jesus. They felt like they could go in Jesus' presence without being condemned and without being looked down critically. I think that's the key. I think we all know that ever since the time of Jesus in the first century church, not all churches, and honestly, let me say this. I'm not saying this to condemn our church. I think this church has done a pretty good job. There is room for improvement, but I think we do a pretty good job, far better than most churches. I think we do a pretty good job of being welcoming to people. People who have questionable character, questionable background, whether we know them or don't know them. I think we do a pretty good job of providing a good, non-critical, non-judgmental environment for them to come and to learn and grow. I think we've done a pretty good job of that. Is there room for improvement? Yes. Let me mention something that I said this morning. You remember one of the stories I told this morning? I told about a church not far from here, within an hour's driving distance easily. One of my good friends, his daughter, who is in her 40s, never been married, goes to this church and got involved in a conversation with the woman. And the woman told her, well, I don't think this church is going to be a good fit for you. Do y'all remember that story? True story, happened this year to my friend. Now, here's the thing that we all need to keep in mind. I've talked with my friend about that quite a bit. He has a right to be upset about it. I was upset about it when I heard the story. His daughter had a right to be upset about it. Churches shouldn't operate like that. But here's something that's important for all of us to understand. I doubt very seriously that wasn't the minister that said that to the daughter. That wasn't one of the deacons. It wasn't one of the elders. It wasn't among the leadership. It was some member of their church. I doubt very seriously that the philosophy of that church is we're going to send people out and screen everyone at the door and make sure that they fit our criterion. If they have never been married when they're in their 40s, or if they've been divorced or whatever, we're going to tell them they're not welcome. I doubt that is the case at all. My point being this: we all, every single one of us, need to be careful about what we say and how we interact with people. Because here's the truth of the matter. The leadership of this church, our ministers and our elders, cannot police what everyone says and does. Right? Would you agree with that? It's impossible. There's no way we can. We have a direction that we're trying to go, which we're trying to go the way of Jesus. What we see Jesus doing and how we see Him interacting with people, that's what we're trying to do. But each and every one of us needs to be careful what we say to someone, because even though I doubt that statement that lady made at that church, that wasn't the philosophy of that church, this guest who came interpreted it as the philosophy of that church, because that's what she heard when she went there on that occasion. Does that make sense? That's why we all need to be real careful about what we say. And individually, we need to make sure that we as individuals are non-critical, non-judgmental, non-fault finding.
What you said earlier about those two young men that were baptized, and what you heard in the locker room, they apparently knew what they were supposed to be baptized for, but then they had no intention of following. Was that a facade they was putting on for who? For the church.
Well, their understanding of baptism was erroneous, actually.
I agree with you, but I'm saying they were actors.
Yeah. Baptism, I always ask people two questions when I'm getting ready to talk to them about being baptized. There's really only two things you need to know. Do you know you're a sinner and you can't save yourself and you need Jesus? And that Jesus was God's Son, paid the penalty for your sins. And the only way you can be saved is through Jesus. Do you understand that? And until they understand that, we won't go any further. Okay? So we understand that. The second question I ask is, even if they do understand that, are you ready to make Jesus the Lord of your life and follow in His steps the rest of your life? Not just right now at a decision, but for the rest of your life. If they say no to that, even if they understand baptism is for the forgiveness of sins, if they say no to that, I won't baptize them. Because when a person is baptized, it means you're marrying Jesus. And when you marry someone, you make a commitment to that person. Do you not? You should know. You did this 8 days ago, right? You make a commitment to someone. And you stand up and you say vows to each other. That's what we're doing at baptism. We're saying vows to Jesus. I'm trusting in what you did on the cross, and I'm vowing to pledge my allegiance to you for the rest of my life. That's actually the words of 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21. It's a pledge of allegiance to Jesus is what baptism is, as Peter says in that verse. That's what it means. And so I think what has happened, the question is, what has happened to reverse the pattern of Jesus so that sinners don't like being around us? Instead of providing this welcoming atmosphere, a lot of churches have provided a judgmental, critical, condescending kind of an atmosphere. And who wants to go into that kind of a setting? Not most people. I think that's what's happened. So let me ask you this. We're going to switch gears here and we're going to go to this. When you look at this picture right here, does that remind you of anything in the Bible? What story? It comes from a story in the Bible. Does anybody? I know I'm not offering a lot of clues. David? David gets the award. This is the story, this is the parable that Jesus told of the Pharisee and the publican in Luke chapter 18. They both go to the temple to pray. Okay? That's one artist's depiction of what that looked like. So look at that for a second. Here's another one I found that's, I thought, very telling. Here's another artist's depiction of it. Tell me what you see in that picture right there. What does it appear that the Pharisees' attitude was like? Haughty. What else? Yeah. Yeah, chest puffed out, haughty, arrogant, looks condescending. I want us to read this story in Luke's Gospel, chapter 18. So turn in your Bibles there. Luke chapter 18, we're going to read verse 9 to 14. Luke 18, 9 to 14. And notice the reason why Jesus tells the parable. This is the preface to the parable. Verse 9. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Here's why Jesus is telling the parable. Because people were confident in their own righteousness and they looked down on everyone else. Kind of like what you see right here, this condescending, arrogant, haughty attitude. And Jesus said, 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and he prayed. Now listen to what he says. Can you imagine this prayer? God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. He probably pointed over to him. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all that I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and he said, God, have mercy on me. And here's what literally it says in the original language. Most of our versions, including my NIV, says, God be merciful to me, a sinner. That is not what it says in the original text. Here's what it says. God be merciful to me, the sinner. He's pointing himself out as I'm the worst sinner that there is. That's how he felt about himself. In verse 14, Jesus said, I tell you that this man, rather than the other, he went home justified before God. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, there's a couple of things I want to point out from this passage, and then I want to get your input from it. I want everybody to be clear. Our behavior, how we live once we become Christians, does matter. It does, certainly. However, that's not how we are accepted by God. We are accepted by God based on the sacrifice of Jesus and our trust in Him. Period. Because if it were our behavior that stood us justified and accepted in God's sight, how many of us would be accepted and justified in God's sight? Not me. None of our behavior is deserving of ever going to live with a perfect God. Our behavior matters, but that is not what stands us accepted before Jesus. So the question I want to ask is, in this parable that we just read, and that we all know, or many of us know, is there anything in this parable that sheds any light on why sinners don't like being around the people of Jesus when plainly they did like being around Jesus? Is there anything in this parable that sheds some light on that? Yeah. And notice what he said. It is arrogance. I think you're hitting right at the core of it. Jesus plainly was not arrogant when he dealt with sinners. He treated them with respect, all people with respect, regardless of what kind of, quote, scum they were, as the religious leaders looked upon them, and some today look on them. He treated all people with respect. He wasn't condescending toward people. He wasn't condemning toward people. Now, he didn't dismiss sin. As Steve pointed out earlier in that story in John chapter 8 that we looked at this morning, the woman caught in adultery. He didn't say, oh, it's fine, just live your best life now and live however you want to, contrary to some popular preachers, last name Osteen. Not that I'm going to get specific, but he wrote a book. Just live your best life now. And so however you want to do it, whatever makes you happy, really. And what's going to make you happy is if you want to be rich like me, yeah, that's just flat out heresy. Not taught anywhere in Scripture. Amazing how many people can believe it. Shows the level of Bible ignorance in our culture. Jesus plainly didn't teach that. Jesus taught, no, your sin is wrong. What you're doing is wrong. Go and leave your life of sin. But he showed her in the process mercy and grace and love and forgiveness, not condemnation.
What the Pharisees guilty of is using the other people, whether it's the Pharisee or the other people he lists, to compare himself to make himself feel better.
Yes.
And that's
like he says in this story, I thank God, he's praying. Can you imagine this? God, I thank you that I'm not like other people. Sinners. See, here's the problem. The problem is if we don't think we're sinners also in the need of grace of God. This Pharisee, his parable basically was this: God, aren't you lucky to have someone as religious and righteous as me on your team? Aren't you lucky, God? Instead, the attitude of this sinner was, he wouldn't even look up to heaven. Lord, be merciful to me, the sinner. People that are saved are people who recognize their sin problem, and they reach out to Jesus. And when we do, we always find His grace and mercy and forgiveness. The worst problem that anybody could ever have is if we think that we're in a situation where I'm good enough to be counted as righteous before God and I don't need Jesus. And that's what this Pharisee was like. And there are people today like that. And that's what turns people off. I've told y'all about my extended family before. I have a weird family. I have Wiccans in my family, people who practice, the witch religion. I have an aunt who was, she was one of those who you would call at the psychic network. And let me tell you, if you're calling her for advice, you're in bad shape. Just a crazy family with all kinds of weird things going on. And I remember, I've told y'all about this at a family reunion one time in Arkansas. That tells you something, too. It's in Arkansas. But anyway, in a very eclectic group of, so Laura and I are there, and Tiffany, a pretty straight-laced, Christian family, and then all these other types. And I remember talking to my cousins, and they wanted us to get in a big argument and fight. They wanted me, the preacher in the family, to get in fight with the Wiccan, the witch-practicing priestess or whatever she was. They wanted us to get in an argument. And I could see what they're doing, and we're not doing that. We're not going to get in a fight. And I told them, I said, here's the thing. They were condemning Christianity because of the way they grew up. They grew up in a very harsh, legalistic environment. Their parents were... I'm sure they were good people in some ways, but they were very inconsistent in practicing their religion. It was harsh. It was very judgmental, critical, etc. And that's what turned them off from Christianity. And what I told them, I said, look, I'm sorry that you experienced that. I'm sorry for what all you went through and the abuse that you went through and etc., etc. I said, but that was a warped version of Christianity. That is not the Christianity that you see when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Jesus, who is the founder of Christianity, that is plainly not how he lived and what he taught. But the point being made is the way that people view us, if we are the main point of contact that they have with Christianity, if we're the main people they see it through, they're going to see Christianity through what they see in us. So doesn't that make it all the more important how we live our lives before other people? We need to make sure that we show people the true version of Christianity. And that is a Christ of grace and love and mercy and forgiveness, who calls sin, sin, but while calling people out of sin, doesn't condemn them, but is trying to offer them a way of mercy and forgiveness through himself. I think that is so, so important. Look at this great verse. Mark chapter 12, verse 37. This is a fascinating little verse. The large crowd listened to him with delight. I love the way the King James Version translates it. It translates it this way. And the common people heard him gladly. The common people. That word for the people is the word for crowd in the original language. And what he means by that is he means people who are not of the religious establishment, people who are not of the leadership, meaning just the general populace of the world. They listened to Jesus. They heard him gladly. They were glad to hear him. So the question that we need to ask is, so why did the common people hear Jesus gladly? So what would your answer be to that? Why did the regular people, the religious leaders didn't like him, but why did the regular common people, the masses we would call them, why did they hear Jesus gladly?
In that culture, those people didn't have a problem in the world thinking there was something greater than themselves. I think so. They were looking to him as something greater than them, and the message he was giving was something greater than theirs.
Okay, he was giving them hope for a greater message, something greater than themselves. Okay. But what caused the common people to listen to Jesus so eagerly and intently and feel comfortable around him? And what was it? He did have something different. Right. Okay. Scott, what were you going to say? What? Of worth. He treated them with respect. That's important for all of us to remember. Everybody in here in this room, we've all done this. We've all had interaction with people before where it's hard to treat them with worth because they've messed up their life so bad and they're so far away from what God originally intended. It's difficult, isn't it? Jesus did that, though. Hang on just a second. All people were created in God's image. All people. No matter how distorted that image currently is, all people have been created in God's image. Does everybody agree with that? Think of the worst person. Don't say their name out loud. Think of the worst person that you can think of. I mean, this person is the most messed up person you have ever seen. You can't stand to be around them. Just get that person's image in your mind. What does Jesus think of that person? He's not endorsing their lifestyle. He's not saying the way they're living is fine, but Jesus created them. He has been created, or she has been created, in the image of God, and they are incredibly valuable to Him. And sometimes we don't treat people like that. I think that's a big reason why people flock to Jesus. They could sense that, and maybe why sometimes they don't flock to us like they should. Okay, Roy, what were you saying?
Verse 38 down there, why so many shy and run away from it is because of what the teachers of the law, they walk around in flowing robes and all that, and showing their importance.
Right.
They're important, not the importance of the Lord.
And so the question of this, exactly, they're showing their importance, showing that they're trying to project themselves as being above the common people. One of the reasons that the common people heard Jesus so gladly is because He appeared common. He came across as common. And if we're going to reach people today, I don't think wearing, I remember Rodney and Anita and I were having a joke, and Leslie here not too long ago. They'd been to somewhere, a Catholic wedding or something. They're like, we need to get you some of those robes and all that stuff, Mike. You look too plain when you're up there preaching. I think it's good to look plain. I think that's kind of what Jesus did. You don't want to elevate yourself above people. You want to, because you are with people. You're a normal person, right? Kim.
Think about how the scribes and Pharisees, what did they, when they saw the common people, they saw one thing. And it's what you talk about almost every Sunday. What the common people were good for their tithes and their offerings to the religious leaders. That was the only value they had.
Yeah. Outside of that, they didn't really see them as having any inherent value. It's only what they could get from them or whatever. Okay?
And Jesus doesn't, you don't have a lot of records of Jesus demanding offerings. You have one time where he stops the show when the lady puts her penny in.
Mm-hmm.
But Jesus is not about sacrifices as much as he is the true worshipers of God in spirit and truth.
Yeah. He cares about the heart. Okay, Gavin?
Well, Jesus is, I think, a big thing is his patience with these people. He allows them to talk before he speaks, and he lets them say what they want to say, and he thinks about how am I going to give this to this person? What I'm going to say, how I'm going to make it to get in their head.
Yeah. He listens to them first. And when you are listened to by someone, that's a good point, Gavin. When you are listened to by someone, if someone takes the time to listen to you, how does that make you feel? It makes you feel important. It makes you feel valued. And I think that's one of the great things that attracted people to Jesus. He would genuinely listen to them because the reason he would genuinely listen to them because Jesus is thinking in his mind, this is the height of my creation, a human being that I have created in my own image. And nothing else is created in my own image. That's how Jesus thought. And let's admit it, we oftentimes lose sight of that. And I think that's what causes us sometimes to belittle people, at least in our mind, if not with our words, and not treat them the way we should. Yes, Ashley. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we need to pay attention to our message and make sure it's the message of love and hope and mercy and grace that Jesus gave, and not some message about you got to get all the rules right, right? Okay, let's close with two questions. This is kind of redundant a little bit, but it's kind of a summary of what we talked about today. In view of Jesus' clear example, how is it that the church has now become a community, largely, there are exceptions to this, but largely the church has become a community of respectability where the down and out no longer feel welcome? How have we gotten to that point? Or do you think the church has gotten to that point? Maybe you disagree with the statement. It depends on the church. You're right. It's not like every church is like that, but I think society-wise, that's how most people view the church. Part of that is not completely justified. It's not always like that, but sometimes it is justified. I've been to churches like that. Maybe you have too. And it's a wonder that anybody comes there, some of the ones I've been to. Here's a lot. Go ahead, Ashley. Or excuse me, Pam. Yeah. We need to get out of our comfort zone and be willing to go to people who are different than us. It's hard for all of us to do. But in order to be a church like Jesus was, we're going to have to ask the help of the Holy Spirit to help us get out of our comfort zone. Last question I want to ask for us all to think about is this right here. What would it take for church to become a place where modern day prostitutes, tax collector types, even self-righteous religious types would gladly gather together here? What would it take? A whole new mindset. And what would that mindset be? It would take a whole new mindset. What would the mindset be? We need to get the right view of Jesus. It goes back to what Ashley was saying earlier. We need to get the message right. What was the plain teaching of Jesus? I think what would be a great exercise for all of us, I've done this before, I would encourage you to do it. Read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When you get done, read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When you get done, read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When you get done, read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I've done a whole year before where all I did was read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John over and 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 over again. Like 20 times a year. When you do that, even as thick-headed as I am, it starts sinking in the way of Jesus, how he was with people. And when we're the way with people, the way Jesus was, I think people in the community, the masses, the common people, will respond the way they did with Jesus in the first century, where they will feel comfortable around us. They will say, you know, this is a great group of people. These are people who won't judge you. They won't condemn you. Now, we're not going to condone sin. We're not going to say, oh, you're this or you're that. It's fine. Just keep on doing it. No, we're not going to say that. Jesus didn't do that, plainly. Jesus said, go and leave your life of sin. But while we're teaching them the truth, we're going to do it in a loving, kind, respectful way. And that will make all the difference in the world. Okay, any closing comments or questions or statements? Okay, I appreciate everybody being here tonight. I appreciate your input. And if you were not able to remember Jesus by taking the Lord's Supper this morning, if you weren't able to be here, that has been prepared for you. You can go through these doors when Matthew is leading us in this song. So let's be standing as we sing this song of encouragement.